Now let's look at some of the authority issues in Indian country: criminal jurisdiction, extradition, MOUs, cross-deputization, hot pursuits, investigations, and orders of protection.
Criminal jurisdiction, what that is that's the essentially the law enforcement powers that a particular agency has given a particular area.
There are a number of different agencies, I guess you will, that would have jurisdiction in Indian country depending on what the crime is, whether that's tribal, state, local, or federal. Agencies may have jurisdiction in Indian country depending on those questions.
The questions we always tell officers when they're getting their federal certification to understand jurisdiction in Indian country that they need to ask is, first, where did the crime occur? Did it occur within Indian country? Number one. Obviously, it's important for us to know whether it occurred within our district as well. The second is who the suspect is, tribal member, non-tribal member. Who's the victim, whether they're a tribal member or non-tribal member. The third is what's the crime? And the reason for that is that some crimes apply in Indian country, but there's also crimes federally that are crimes of general application, and it doesn't matter where they occur. So it could occur in Indian country if it's a drug offense. It wouldn't matter who the offenders are.
We have criminal jurisdiction and the tribal jurisdiction. We make arrests on Indians that fall within the reservation. And then we have state jurisdiction, which is pretty much it's open. So we have people that come through the reservation or stopped on a reservation. We have criminal jurisdiction over them. Now, if it's a offense that's major, where the victim is an Indian and the suspect a non-Indian, and that turns into a federal case.
Well, there are advantages of working within the three systems that we work with, and what's going to be the determining factor for how we deal with that crime and those individuals is who perpetrated what crime against who. The color of your skin is going to determine what course of action is going to be laid.
One of the factors that we have to look at federally to determine if we have jurisdiction is whether the tribe itself, the federally recognized tribe, recognizes that individual as a tribal member. But if there was sufficient indicia, in addition to Indian blood, it may be that that person would still qualify federally as an Indian even if the tribe didn't recognize them.
If the perpetrator is non-Indian and the victim is Indian, then the jurisdiction goes to the federal government. The state has no jurisdiction in that case because the victim is Indian. The tribe has no jurisdiction in that case unless it's one of the recent changes to the Violence Against Women Act, which does have limited provisions for domestic violence perpetrators who are non-Indian to be tried in tribal court. But generally speaking, the tribe would not have jurisdiction in that case either, so the jurisdiction would go to the federal government. If it's Indian on Indian, then Indian perpetrator and an Indian victim, then both the tribe and the federal government have jurisdiction in those cases. If it's a native suspect perpetrator and a non-native victim, again, the tribe has no jurisdiction because of the non-native victim. The state has no jurisdiction, so it's up to federal prosecution in those cases. And if it's non-native and non-native, non-native perpetrator and a non-native victim, then the state court has jurisdiction. And that's regardless, as long as it happens on Indian country. The state court would still have jurisdiction. So if, for example, Coconino County Sheriff were on the Navajo reservation and observed a domestic violence situation at the roadside, and it was two non-natives, then the deputy would have full authority to make the arrest and to book the perpetrator or perpetrators into a county jail facility and charge them under state court. The fact that it occurred on Indian country really has no standing in that case. So if, however, the same officer observed a domestic violence and it were a native perpetrator and a non-native victim, then he wouldn't have jurisdiction. It would have to be handled through another court.
We have a vehicular collision that occurs on a reservation. Our troopers respond, the tribal police respond. We get there, if we find out if it's all tribal involvement, and let's say it's a DUI-related, DUI drivers alive, able to be prosecuted for this crime that they've occurred. We work together in Navajo Nation, where most of my troopers work. We have cross commission, so we can take the whole case, but many times, since we're both there, we work it out on scene to where it's like, you know, our troopers will take the collision, you guys can take the criminal aspect since it's all tribal. It's just, it's working well together by splitting the demands out there, and they can deal with the tribal members. They're from the community, all the court's gonna be there, all the follow-up's gonna be there. We can deal with the traffic. Most of the time our troopers are, the expertise level in the collision aspect's a little bit higher. We have the, you know, systems automated to get the collision into ADOT for statistical reasons, so it works out best that way.
We'll give the example that a Coolidge police officer is traveling through the Gila River Indian community to attend training at Arizona Post. And while on the way, he encounters, he sees a vehicle swerving, and there's obviously some type of a fight going on in the vehicle, and it turns out to be a domestic violence situation between two tribal members. Although the officer doesn't have the authority to make an arrest in that situation, he would certainly be expected to detain the suspects, calm the situation, make sure there's no more harm, and contact the Gila River Indian Community Police to take jurisdiction over that, to make the arrest, to do the booking and charge it.
We try to have the tribal agency take primary in that area for multiple reasons. If it's a domestic violence case, they're going to be more familiar with what resources that victim has than my troopers will within that community. I can say the Navajo Nation has some very good resources out there for the victims of all crimes, but I can't, you know, if I go over to Wallapai, I can't speak as freely on the Wallapai because I haven't worked there as much. So in those situations, our troopers would reach out to the local office community, even if they were cross-commissioned, and discuss the benefits of them taking the criminal aspect of that case, or at least provide us with that tribe, that nation's victim rights type forms, so we can give that victim some guidance.
If you're driving through and you see something happen, you on-viewed that. And by on-viewing that, you're right there. So you still have the authority to take enforcement action. You just have to notify that tribal law enforcement agency that you took that action on their land so they can come out and deal with it appropriately.
The one thing that we tell every officer we train when we go through the LEIIC training is, when in doubt, give us a call. Because for the most part, those crimes that occur within Indian country, where it's two tribal members involved, it's either going to be tribal or federal jurisdiction. If it's two non-tribal members, even if it occurs within Indian country, it's going to be state jurisdiction. But there's a lot of permutations of that as you start changing the players and what the crime is and where it occurred at.
It's happened, and it'll continue to happen, where you have that cross-jurisdiction crime problem. A crime is committed on the reservation, it leaves the reservation and comes into Phoenix or Scottsdale, but then the crime continues. So we always are having to kind of sort some of those things out at the very end. And I think in my experiences, everybody was always willing to work it out. Okay, well the feds are going to have this piece of it. Scottsdale or Phoenix PD, we're going to have this piece of it, or Mesa PD, and we typically collaborated with those agencies. And I think communication is just the key. It's whenever you have something either comes onto the reservation or leaves the reservation, the easiest thing to do is pick up the phone and call the adjoining agency and look for assistance.
Extradition is the surrender of a defendant from one jurisdiction to another. And this happens a lot. It's up to each tribe on how they want to do their extradition process. Each tribe is different.
Most tribes have extradition policies and procedures in place, and while we as the federal government have jurisdiction over crimes that occur within Indian country if they fall within certain categories, we don't have to extradite defendants because our federal warrants are good for them in Indian country as well as they would be anywhere else. But I think where the confusion lies oftentimes is state or local officers think that if they have a state or local warrant that they can just go arrest that individual in Indian country. And the reality is that when that occurs, they need to go through the tribe and they need to follow its extradition policies to get that individual released to them.
Salt River's extradition process was very different from Gila River's. Gila River's, they could actually be extradited based on signing a paper, a form, and saying, yeah, I'm ready to go to 4th Ave. Sign their rights, they're going to 4th Ave. Salt River was different. It took a longer time, I think 10 days, for it to even, and it'd have to go through, you know, the tribal court, and so it was different.
There are some that want an original copy of a warrant that has that court stamp on it where you can actually feel the raise in the paper. You know, others just say, we just want a photocopy of the warrant with a report done from our tribal law enforcement agency saying, I received this warrant from officer so-and-so with such and such police department or such and such sheriff's office.
With the federal government, we're able to extradite somebody obviously off once we get a detainer for them or a valid federal arrest warrant. Stateside, it's a little bit different, whereas, you know, somebody with a state warrant on the reservation, unless the tribe endorses or signs off on that person, you know, being arrested by the state, they can't be extradited off there for the state charges.
If an officer, a non-tribal officer, is involved in a hot pursuit, and that pursuit ends on Indian country, then the officer would certainly make the stop, make the detention, and then contact the tribal police for guidance on what their extradition procedure is. In some cases, it can be as simple as the supervising officer for the tribal police agency saying, go ahead and take this person back to where the crime occurred. In other cases, the suspect would be arrested, booked into a tribal jail, and the officer would go through the tribal prosecutor to obtain an extradition, to have the tribal judge hear the case and rule on whether that person would be returned to state custody.
We have a law, which is the Fugitive from Justice Law, which is our extradition law, that says that as long as that entity has a valid warrant for that individual's extradition to that jurisdiction, there has to be a request for an FJ warrant. Once that warrant is issued, we pick up that individual on that Fugitive from Justice warrant, bring him before the court. The court looks at the merits of the warrant and the request to have that person extradited off the reservation, this tribal member extradited off the reservation, and if it's granted and warranted, then that jurisdiction has 24 hours to come and get them.
Once a tribal member leaves tribal lands, their sovereignty as a Native American ends, and they're then a citizen of the state of Arizona. So if they commit a crime in Phoenix and the tribe has a warrant on them, they may call that jail and say, hey, when you're done, can you give us a call and let us know they're a tribal member, we want to come get them.
It's very important to know your local judges, and even if you may not know the law, if you've already had a relationship built there, you can call that local judge and say, hey, this is the situation we've got, how should we address it? Again, it's relationship based, and you hear troopers or officers always talking about the relationship between the line level law enforcement. You need to get relationships with the courts and the judges also, because it will help you in your investigations.
By communicating and working with those folks from Indian country law enforcement agencies, hey, what's your extradition process? Hey, if we ever have this happen, how do we go about getting that person extradited? And you know what, if those officers don't know, they're gonna go back, hey, Sarge, hey, Lieutenant, hey, Chief. You know, this agency was asking me about how they do the extradition process here. What do I tell them?
The advice for a street cop I'd have would be to first contact the local tribal law enforcement agency to see what can be done.
You have to remember you wear different hats. And just because you wear different hats does not mean that gives you authority to do everything. You may have a federal hat you wear, you may have a state hat you wear, you may have a tribal hat you wear, but it doesn't mean you wear all three hats at the same time. And depending upon what it is that you're doing may determine which hat you're wearing. So for instance, if a tribal officer were to have a tribal warrant for an individual that was being held in a state facility, that tribal officer wouldn't just have the ability to go to that state facility and pick them up, because they'd be wearing their tribal hat to execute that warrant, and their tribal hat only extends to the edge of the reservation. If they have to go off the reservation to do that, then they may not have the authority. To cover that, what's happened is a lot of jurisdictions have created these MOUs between the tribal authorities and the state or local authorities to let them do exactly that. But that's where communication is really key.
We will continue our look at hot-button authority issues in a moment. But first, let's see what you learned about criminal jurisdiction and extradition. You will now be automatically redirected to the Unit 8 assessment module.